So, in the spring of 1969, I came home from school. I was in 4th grade. And my parents gathered us all. I'll tell you who we all are in a moment. And did what parents often did back in the 60s. They made a pronouncement. And the pronouncement is, our family is going to move to Puerto Rico. I was shocked. My brother Paul, 4 years older than I am, he was transitioning into just about to go into high school, middle school. I had been in PS 130 since kindergarten, and just loved, my school and my teachers. And my next brother Gamaliel was just 18 months younger than I am. He was struggling in school, but he was kind of shocked. And then my youngest, my brother after that, Sam, he was even younger. It didn't register with him, much less with Danny, the youngest one. At the time, we were five boys. My mother eventually had a girl, and hence I often refer to her, we refer to her as the person that if at first you don't succeed, try again. That was my mom. It took 6 times, but she finally got her girl. So my parents made that announcement in April of 1969, and just to put it in context, within that last year, prior to that announcement, Martin Luther King had been assassinated. Robert Kennedy had been assassinated. I remember that previous winter, we'd also had the blizzard of 1968, which devastated the Northeast and New York City, paralyzed the city for over a week. But none of that was really material or really the focus of a 9-year-old. My focus was on the fact that Star Trek had announced that they were not going to continue the series. I remember when it first came out, and I knew what night it was. So I went to church, and they were trying to decide which night the worship services were going to be. So I wrote down that we shouldn't have it, I think it was on Tuesday night, because that was the night of Star Trek, so we should have worship service on that night. The other looming thing for me was that I had, Mr. Levine, the principal of our school, had seen my 4th grade essay on the bulletin board outside my classroom, and plucked it off the board and brought it in and asked Mr. Ongania, who was my 4th grade teacher, who had written this essay. And he pointed to me, and Mr. Levine said, this is really outstanding. This is a really good essay. I'd written my essay on who I wanted to be when I grew up, and it was a combination of John F. Kennedy and Dr. Spock. That's who I wanted to be. And that was pretty big, for a 9-year-old whose parents were evangelical Christians, because when John F. Kennedy became president, even though I was very young, I was 4, around 4, I don't remember any of that, but I do remember my parents kind of buying into that whole notion that, oh, he's Catholic, and now the Pope is going to tell us what to do, and buying into that whole notion. But what the other thing I remember is the funeral. I remember watching John Kennedy Jr. in his little shorts. For those of you that are old enough, you may remember. And it was, I just remember because I remember going up to the TV, putting my hand on the screen, and it was like, I don't know, it was like a bond. And a few years ago when John Kennedy Jr. died, it really touched me deeply. And I felt like that was a circle. And so what I really want to tell you about is another circle. So my parents make this announcement, and we're going to go to Puerto Rico. And it's 1969, and school finishes. I didn't mention my parents are both from Puerto Rico, so for them it's going back home. So they pack us all up. My mother takes us to Puerto Rico. My father stays back in New York to kind of sell all the furniture and close down the apartment. An apartment which, by the way, in 1969 in New York City, rent control was 4 bedrooms. It was $68 a month. Yeah, it really was. We left that, we moved to Puerto Rico. My father had grown up as an orphan in Puerto Rico in the 1920s and came to New York, came to the United States in the hope of becoming a horse jockey. He worked with horses since he was very little, and he met my mother, and of course that plan went out the window. And the reason why we were moving to Puerto Rico is really incredible from a world perspective. What happened is that my father had learned to become a diamond cutter by working as a short order cook in a restaurant near 47th Street. And he was literally plucked out of there by these Jewish men with big black hats and little curls on the side of their heads who thought he was Jewish and invited him to come learn how to become a diamond cutter. Literally. My father's claim to fame, he cut the diamond that Richard Burton gave to Elizabeth Taylor. He cut that diamond. So he was pretty confident when he moved to, when he had this opportunity to move to Puerto Rico because of what was going on in the US, because of what was going on in New York City at the time. So he decided, along with my mother, we were going to move to Puerto Rico. So off we go. We land in Puerto Rico. It's summertime. We go to live with my grandmother. We find a house in a town called Caguas, Puerto Rico. Caguas, Puerto Rico. And my mother takes us dutifully to the school to be enrolled for that following school year. And of course, even though my parents speak Spanish, and Spanish is my first language, we did not know how to read or write in Spanish. We just spoke Spanish at home. So the Puerto Rico school system had an answer for that. They had a way to deal with that. Every child gets put back a grade. That's how you deal with kids not knowing how to read or write in Spanish. You just put them back a grade. So having been a high-achieving reader and having been told that in 5th grade I would be going into the newly instituted talented and gifted program in the New York public school system, it was devastating to me. It was, and again, I'm sure that my brothers felt equally strong, but I was devastated. It was just beyond me that I would be put back a grade. So I went to my mother and I told her, I can't let this happen. By which, of course, I mean, we can't let this happen. And my mother, who had only in her lifetime achieved in academic grades, getting to the 9th grade, set upon the task of teaching me to read and write in Spanish in one summer. let me cut to the chase and tell you she did it. And the way she did it is she got a New Testament Bible that had one column in English and one column in Spanish. And that summer, by working every day, I learned the alphabet. I learned to read and distinguish individual letters. Then I learned to read individual words. And then eventually I was reading full sentences by the end of the summer. And we went to school at the beginning of the school year, and I was not put back a grade, unlike my brothers who suffered that consequence. And it made me incredibly, incredibly proud to have accomplished that. So I get through the 5th grade and the 6th grade, and then another world event happens, one that maybe most of you have not heard of. In that time, so we're talking in the early 70s, 1971, there was a strike in South Africa. It was the diamond mines. The workers went on strike. De Beers, the world leader in diamonds, was paralyzed. There were no diamonds to be had at any price. And my father, who had moved to Puerto Rico and been immediately embraced as someone who knew how to cut diamonds by a local company, being the last hired, was one of the first to be let go. And my family again went into this mode of like, what are we going to do? At that time, we had had a visitor at our church from Connecticut, specifically from Wallingford, Connecticut, a Reverend Juan Torres. And my father and my mother were debating whether or not to return to New York City. Things from their point of view had gotten worse in New York City, not better. So Juan Torres told my dad, you should come to Connecticut. Connecticut is this really great place. You're close to New York. And so my father, very hesitantly, and very slowly came to the thinking, we need to leave Puerto Rico. So he packed up this time, and he came first. And on a dark evening, he arrived in Wallingford, Connecticut, to the home of Reverend Juan Torres at 70 Main Street in Wallingford, Connecticut, went to bed, woke up the next morning, and opened the windows, the shade, and saw a cemetery across the street on Main Street. My father had lived, when he first came to the United States, he had lived in Miami, he'd lived in Dallas, he went out to California, to San Diego, then he finally settled in New York. And when he opened that window and he saw that cemetery across the street, he said, my family is not living in this town, that we cannot live in. Even though he found a fabulous job at International Silver. If those of you remember International Silver, he was a floor worker, just on the regular factory floor. And he was lifting and bringing supplies around. They let him go from that job. Not because he didn't do the work, because he was too short. Literally, they told him, you're too short. You can't really reach all the bins. We got to let you go. So then my father got a job at Meriden Wallingford Hospital, now Midstate, and he worked there till the day he retired, almost 30 years later. So he comes up, he settles in Meriden, and then he brings the family up, and we move to Colony Street in Meriden. And, to Colony Street. Eventually, we wound up at the Mills Low-Income Housing Projects in Meriden, and I go to Thomas Jefferson Middle School on Center Street in Meriden. So I show up at the school from Puerto Rico. It's 1971. So what do they do with a kid that comes from Puerto Rico? They put him in the trailer in the back of the school with Mr. DeLuca and the kids that speak Polish and the kids that speak Italian and the kids that speak Spanish, because there is no Bilingual Education Act. So we don't have any rights. So I go to Mr. DeLuca, I said, Mr. DeLuca, I speak English. I shouldn't be in here. So of course he clearly understands that I speak English, but there's no process to get me out, right? So he talks to Mrs. Wysocki, the counselor, and she says, well, you know, we don't know quite what to do because this is the process. So I said, you know, why don't you let me go into a regular class where I have Mrs. Welch as my English teacher. Just put me in there, see if I can perform in the class. So there's no process, so they put me in the class at every level. Here's this little, you know, under 5 foot tall Puerto Rican kid saying, read my lips. I can, you know, I understand English. And so, by the way, Mrs. Welch, like, she was beautiful. She was tall. She was about 5'5", but you know, I was like 4'10", so she was tall, right? And I just kind of fell in love with her, you know. And so I did especially well in her class. But they needed a way to transition me out, so they called this psychologist in. I had to go to a psychologist so that they could determine that I could speak English, which I had been speaking all along. Eventually, I wound up in regular classes. I went on to high school and college, graduate school, wound up in New Haven. About 12, 15 years ago, I'm sitting in a meeting here in New Haven. It's a meeting of the board of an organization called the New Haven Environmental Justice Network. And on the board is this retired gentleman whose name is John Dixon. He lives in Westville. And we're sitting, we've been in many meetings together, and all of a sudden, John turns to me and he says, I know when I first met you. I met you at Thomas Jefferson Middle School. I evaluated you. They said something about you needing an evaluation. I couldn't understand why, because like you spoke perfect English and Spanish. I didn't know what I was evaluating you for. That's when I first met you. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. And that is the end of my story.